thank you guys for joining us to Insight Live with Cerna Solutions. I am Tim Leigh. I host these from time to time whenever we can, and I'm joined today by my distinguished colleagues. Why don't we go ahead and tell me your name, tell me where you're from, and give us a little bit of background with your ServiceNow experience.
Sure, I'll go first, Tim. Thanks. My name's Jeff Marlow. I am based out of Chicago, Illinois. I've been working on the platform for approximately, I think this year is my 11th year. So worked on most of the modules. Obviously do have quite a bit of experience and expertise within the CMDB. I have worked quite extensively in asset management as well, so that is another area of interest of mine. But yeah, really enjoy the content we're going to discuss today. So really looking forward to chatting with you.
Awesome.
And I guess hi everyone. My name is Blake Davis. I am from a little town called Dothan, Alabama. I've been doing ServiceNow for about 7 years or so now, pretty much extensively handling the CMDB, asset management, software asset management, as well as discovery and service mapping. Those are kind of always been my focuses as I've gone through.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys for joining us. I really appreciate it. I know that this is your first time. You've been with Cerna for a while, but this is your first time actually joining us for one of these podcast events. And this is, I think, the perfect topic for us to have you guys join us for the first time. So, we really appreciate it. Obviously, today we are talking about healthy CMDB, happy CMDB. We wanted to do this topic because we hear so many of our customers say that the CMDB is the heart of their ServiceNow operation. But more often than not, it may not be in the state that they consider to be ideal. So we want to talk a little bit more about what is an ideal state for CMDB, and if there is work that can be done, what are the goals for us to move forward on that. So I'll go ahead and just get some quick housekeeping out of the way. A question that we get quite often: are these sessions recorded? Yes, they will be emailed to you. It is recorded, and we will be posting it onto our website, cernasolutions.com, as well as the YouTube page on the Cerna Solutions page on YouTube. If you guys can go there, if you like this type of content, check out and see some of the other podcasts that we've done. Subscribe if you want to see more of those videos, and hit the notification if you want to be alerted of when we have new content that's put up. You can also find a lot of news about Cerna on LinkedIn. So that's a really great place if you like these types of webinars or podcasts, or even want to see some of the other type of work that we're doing. Definitely go to LinkedIn and check out Cerna Solutions there. And then if you do have questions, just go ahead and use the questions feature, not the chat, but the questions feature on the GoToWebinar panel. Don't wait until the end to ask your questions. As soon as you have it, go ahead and let us know. This is really what I think is the best way to get value out of this type of session, is for us to see what types of questions you have while we're talking about them, and then see if we can steer the conversation to help you out and really get the unique information that you need that's specific to your business. And let's just go ahead and set up what we're going to be talking about today. So very first and foremost, we want to define what CMDB health actually means. We're going to talk a little bit more about what a plan could be for maintaining a healthy CMDB. And if your CMDB is not perfect, how are you going to treat that? Not treat in the medical sense, not in a etiquette sense of what to do when your CMDB is less than healthy, or we'll just say inefficient for right now. So let's break the ice. Let's talk a little bit more with a simple question. What does CMDB health actually mean? And Jeff, I'll throw that to you first.
Yeah, sure. So it's a kind of a loaded question, a big question, but an important one. So I think it starts with three sort of main areas. Data inputs, right? How do we get data into the CMDB? And obviously this kind of podcast is predicated on data coming into your CMDB. Obviously, we'll talk about this briefly, but the second piece is managing the CMDB, not just loading, not a kind of a set it and forget it mentality, but loading the data. Once you've loaded the data in, maintaining and managing it. So having someone responsible for managing the data once it's imported. And then third and almost most important is usage. How is it folded into the other process areas. So you can spend, and a lot of clients spend a long time implementing or loading data into their CMDB, whether it be discovery, spreadsheets, SCCM. They're tens or hundreds of methods to import into the CMDB. But really, if you're not using your CMDB, what is it good for? So those are three main areas to indicate CMDB health. And if you're importing data with a regular frequency, you're maintaining or managing your data with your regular frequency, and you're using your data with a regular frequency, that generally means you have a fairly healthy CMDB. Now, there are obviously ranges of health, but those three topics are really critical.
And Blake, I mean, obviously, you've worked with a number of customers in their CMDB. Can you tell me, would you say that any customer, you can define their CMDB as 100% healthy? Have you ever seen that in your years?
Absolutely not. There is kind of a term in CMDB where we're always chasing perfection. Nobody's CMDB is perfect, but we always try to chase that perfection so we can achieve an excellent CMDB. Being able to kind of go in is an ultimately subjective term for what do you define as, my CMDB is working for me. It's working for my organization.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. And I think that, we all discussed an analogy. I think we'll just throw it out early so that we can call back on it when needed. But, in our earlier conversations, I know that we talked about how some people think of their CMDB as kind of like a car. You buy a car and you get the oil changed every once in a while. And when it's needed to be fixed, you bring it into the shop. But in reality, our CMDB is really more like a garden, in the sense that if you're not working on it regularly, and you turn around and look back at it, it's going to have a lot of stuff there that you didn't want there, or it's going to, not be where it needs to be. So, I mean, can you guys speak to that a little bit more? I mean, is that a feature that you think most customers are aware of, or do you think that in most cases it's sort of the earlier example there?
Yeah. So I can touch on the first piece. So I think most mature organizations, they consider the implementation, the loading of CIs as kind of the most exhaustive or highest level of effort of the processes. Whereas once you've loaded the CIs into your CMDB, that's when really the level of effort begins, right? You have to, and we'll get into this later, you have to have a dedicated resource. You have to maintain it. So it's not about getting all of your, boiling the ocean is a term we like to use a lot. It's not about loading all of your CIs. It's about loading CIs, using them, and maintaining them. So I think a lot of clients tend to overlook the maintenance piece, or tend to underestimate the level of effort that it takes to really maintain it.
Mm-hmm. So why is it important? I mean, we talked a little bit about why do you even have it, but what's the so what for CMDB health in general? I mean, what are people giving up by not focusing on the health of their CMDB?
Sure. I can start to answer that, and Blake, if you want to fill in. So really, it's about, so I know that the concept of ROI is one that's brought up quite frequently with the CMDB, and to be honest, it's generally worth the effort. Not necessarily, I mean, asset management tracks the inventory, the financial cost of your equipment, but the large value is reducing mean time to resolution, in that if we haven't folded in the CMDB into incident problem change, and we're logging incidents, our service desk is doing their job, they're tracking incidents, they're resolving, they're closing incidents, they're opening, doing root cause analysis, they're logging change requests, but they're not selecting the appropriate configuration item, then we're losing a lot of money, and it's hard to put a financial cost around that until it's been done, until we're able to identify, well, this year, now that we're tracking the outages, the impact to business for these configuration items, it cost us this much, but we were able to resolve it in a much shorter duration. So that's a big win, is reducing mean time to resolution, being able to resolve, being able to identify the patches or the changes that are being applied to configuration items. So when your end user calls in and the service desk is looking to resolve those incidents as quickly as possible, they're able to identify, these pieces of equipment have recently undergone change requests, and in all likelihood, this is the root cause, or this is where we'll start our efforts.
And the only other thing I would add to that as well is just, in addition to why, the ROIs and all that stuff is very important, but also a healthy CMDB is worth the effort for your organizational maturity as your organization matures over time. Being able to automate and orchestrate different tasks and, set up automated remediation of problems before they become a call in, before somebody is already contacted. We already know about it, and the only way we can accurately do that in ServiceNow is with a healthy CMDB.
Mm-hmm. So what about in terms of, we talked about how accuracy is definitely, part of the goal here, but I mean, hold on, we got a question here that I wanted to tie to that one specifically. They say that defining health should be, the accuracy of the data. And how, are we going to, and we can either answer this now or later if that's possible, but are we able to discuss, how you discover software which is copied to the server, meaning it's not registered, or how do you know if your installed software, hold on, it cut off there, that your installed software inventory is accurate? Is that something that we think we should cover now, or is that something that we're going to go into a little bit later on in this session?
So the installed software and accuracy, that's kind of a bit of the software asset management piece that we won't necessarily talk about today. Okay. It certainly can be a separate topic, but very valid and very useful. Just I don't, as it relates to the health, and I don't know that it'll come up.
Okay. So
great question though.
Yeah, more along the lines of CMDB in practice. So we can cover that maybe offline if that's something that might help you out there. But let's go ahead and move on a little bit more. So we have some more visual content, but just to kind of set up the topic here, in terms of measuring and maintaining that CMDB health. I know that a lot of people have thrown us some questions about the health dashboard in ServiceNow. And so I wanted to get into that a little bit here, just to kind of set up the concepts. Now, this is obviously content that you can Google and find this out, but I want to dig a little bit deeper into each of these concepts with you guys and really understand some more real world business applications for what these mean and why people should be focused on this. And I'm not trying to tell ServiceNow marketing how to do their job, but I think you could have easily made this 4 C's. I know that the 3 C's and an R is kind of a joke, but that relationships portion, you could easily pick a word like connections or correlations. But I don't know, maybe relationships is really just the best way that we can put this in here. But let's talk about this a little bit more. Yeah, Jeff, I know that this was a portion that you wanted to speak to specifically. Can you talk a little bit more about, the dashboard and completeness and what this means directly for ServiceNow customers?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know the CMDB health dashboard is an area that I know a lot of us are passionate about, but I'm quite honestly very excited. We haven't gotten in the 11 or so years. It's been a while since we've had a nice present, and this CMDB health dashboard is really a nice numerical representation of the health of your CMDB or an organization's CMDB. Now, we'll get into the specific metrics here shortly, but obviously just want to point out, that CMDB health is a bit subjective, right? What matters to one industry doesn't necessarily translate to another. So this CMDB health board out of box is very configurable and is sort of vanilla. So we'll talk a little bit about some examples, some valid examples that, we'll even assign some homework at the end here. But, what the first C here is completeness. And the completeness metric is an aggregate of both required and recommended fields. So when we say required fields, what we're talking about is on the dictionary entry of a particular class. So if we're talking about the computer class, if you've made any number of fields required at the dictionary entry level, it will be identified here under the required or missing attribute. So in general, for clients that are starting out and they're just implementing their CMDB, maybe a phase 1, phase 2, we don't typically recommend, using another term here, recommend implementing the required field for a couple of reasons, but primarily if we think of this use case, right? So we've got someone in the service desk who is investigating an incident. They've identified, they've done their job and identified the appropriate configuration item that is impacted, and they've done their research. They find out, let's say, the support group or the owned by or the managed by field is not populated, but in their investigation, they've identified the appropriate contact. But we've actually gone in and said, for all computers, we need serial number to be a required field. Well, if they go in, the service desk technician is going in to be helpful and fill that bit of information out. Well, they can't because they don't know the serial number in that case. So it's prohibitive in that sense. For more mature organizations where they do have regulation and they manage the input and they manage the different attributes, that may be less of a concern. So it becomes a little prohibitive to facilitate and allow your end users to update your CMDB. Now, the flip side of that is making recommended attributes or making recommendations. And this is actually unique. So if you go into the CI class manager and you're managing a particular class, so let's take the example of computers. And let's say we want to recommend that the location is populated. We want to recommend the serial number is populated. And let's say we want to recommend that the managed by is populated. You can define recommended fields at each level, at each class. So in this case, it's a little bit less prohibitive. It still affects the same outcome eventually, but it's a good kind of a gentle way to work into the completeness health dashboard. So those are the two metrics that make up the completeness. The next one is correctness, and this is to make a callback to our gardening reference, a little less gardening, a little more lawn care. There are 3 letters, and I've rearranged them, taken artistic license here to make up sod, right? So for correctness, we have staleness, orphan, and duplicate. Now, staleness is really defined. There's an out-of-box property that's defined effectively 60 days. If your configuration item hasn't been updated in 60 days, it's considered stale. So, you can create staleness at the class level. So you could say maybe my computers should be updated more frequently. Let's reduce that to 30 days, or perhaps maybe my Windows servers need to be 30 days and my network gear maybe every 90 days. You can define staleness at different levels. Orphan is something that isn't defined out of box. It's something that you do have to define, and it's depending on the class, you could say a configuration item. So let's say maybe a Windows server without any relationships, that would be considered an orphan CI, because all of what use is a Windows server if it's not related to maybe the applications that run on it or other infrastructure. So maybe we consider that an orphan rule. So that can be one of the orphan rules that you define. You can also say, what if maybe we're not at the maturity level where we're defining relationships? Maybe a configuration item or computer is considered orphaned if it doesn't have a managed by field. So maybe you indicate ownership by populating the managed by. So you can also define managed by being empty as an indicator of an orphan CI. Now the last one here is duplicate, and this one is less configurable. It's based off of the identification rules, and the identification rules are configurable in themselves, but consider the identification rules, is based off of generally the FQDN, the MAC address, serial number. Those are indicators of uniqueness. And if we find configuration items that have the same MAC address, FQDN, serial number, then that may be an indication of a duplicate CI. So that kind of makes up the correctness. And then the last C is compliance. And this is a little more, to be honest, this is a little more advanced. So we'll go through this rather quickly, but the audit, the compliance dashboard is based off of audit rules, and the audit rules are very configurable. One example would be if an industry requires that all computers running Windows OS have to have at least, let's say, a gig of RAM. You can define an audit rule to say anything under a gig of RAM is out of compliance and fails the audit report. You can do things like that. The audit rules are very industry specific, so that's again a bit more of an advanced concept. But that's another example of the compliance dashboard that clients will typically configure. And again, it's based off of class. So you can define an audit rule for a business critical services. You can define an audit rule, like I mentioned, for Windows workstations. It really depends on the industry. So that's effectively the best example, at least the most broadly applicable example. We could define for compliance. And then the last and final letter here, R, is relationships. And this is really the same concept as the correctness. So we use the acronym SOD, staleness, orphan, and duplicate. It's the same concept here, but applied to relationships. This is not configurable. So really, when you activate these scheduled jobs in your instance, these will there isn't a whole lot you have to do to configure these. Now, if you don't have any relationships defined, you're not going to see much information here. But as you can see, there's duplicate, orphan, and stale, or stale, orphan, duplicate. And this would be considered, so a stale relationship would be any relationship where either the parent or the child configuration item hasn't been updated in a 60-day window. So if either of the devices hasn't been updated for a period of time, that would be considered stale. Orphaned would be where the parent or child is empty. And then duplicate would be based on this isn't based on the identification rules. This is where the parent, child, and type, and I even think port, where all four of those attributes are identical, then that would be considered a duplicate. So those are the three C's and one R. But go ahead.
I want to jump back real quick, just a little bit. So
sure.
Obviously, this is the main dashboard for CMDB Health. And I know that we've already established that this can be subjective to your unique organization, but in your opinion, how do you use these scores? How can you tell what score is a good enough score for your organization, and how do you maintain that decision for your organization?
So I think the 2/3 rule, right? So roughly 66%. My indicator of success is usually achieved for 70 to 80%. Now, if you're at 100%, restrict your rules, create some more regiment or complicated. So add required or recommended fields to your completeness scorecard. Define some orphan rules. Make them a little more strict. You don't want to see 100% on here at all times, because that's an indicator you're not defining orphan rules, you're not defining staleness rules, you're not defining recommended fields. So as you improve, as the score increases to 80%, 90%, implement some more recommended fields, add some more staleness or orphan rules, so that number comes down, and try to increase usage of the CMDB. So, kind of incremental improvement is what I'd recommend. Go ahead.
So I think that's a really interesting point, because I think that for, when we already got started talking about how this is a frequent activity, this is something that's really more of a balancing act than anything else. To have a really high score that means you're not catching problems, right? And that if your score keeps kind of going up and up and up, that's an opportunity for you to improve as opposed to, or to create uh, more strength and more health in your CMDB as opposed to a sign that just everything's fine. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah. I don't recommend looking at the CMDB health dashboard as we're not trying to ace the test here. What we're trying to do is use it. And if we're at the 60 to 70%, that's an indicator that we're succeeding. And if we see areas of, in this case, right, we're failing a ton of audit, there's an opportunity to improve the audit, the compliance activities. So there's always room for improvement. And really, we're not trying to ace the CMDB health dashboard. We're trying to hit that 2/3 and succeed.
Okay. And I know that, we talk about best practices, and that's a lot of the questions that we had. And I know that, there's a subset of people in this field that kind of bristle at the term best practices because there's really no one way to best practice. But it sounds like, there really are some better practices or good practices that people can be reviewing as they kind of grow and mature their CMDB practice. What about in terms of the challenges of using the dashboard? And Blake, can you talk a little bit more in terms of what are some of the first steps to populating it, and what are some of the challenges that you see customers have in really getting this tool off the ground?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things is, setting it up, defining your standards. Like when you look at a CI for the first time, you look at your computers, you look at your servers, you know, it from your organization, you need to make that determination. And this is not something that a ServiceNow administrator is going to do. This is something that, your Windows administrators are going to help you with. These are the people who care about these CIs. They're the ones that are going to sit down and help you define those standards when you set up that health dashboard. Those are the people you want involved to say, okay, we're in our first phase, like Jeff said, we're not doing any required fields, but what are the recommended fields that we care about? What are the things that, on every CI we want to see? And getting their input and getting their involvement, it can be a challenge depending on your organization, but it's also incredibly important to make those rules as accurate as possible, to make those numbers, to make that tool as valuable as you can. One of the other things is reviewing the dashboard. There is no automated system that's going to tell you, hey, this is bad, this is bad. Somebody has to come out and take a look at this thing periodically. We need a human going in, reviewing this data, looking at the problems, and making creating actions to remediate those steps, be it processes, remediation tasks that we'll dive into, putting together reconciliation rules, all those fun things. Those are all parts of someone having to go in and actually look at this data. And that's what, Jeff has mentioned it earlier. We talk about this concept of hiring into a dedicated configuration manager. It's a valuable person to have in your team who cares about this data, much like you would have an asset manager.
And I want to get into that more specifically, but I'm thinking more in terms of, the setup process. I know that we had talked earlier about how, and you touched on this just a little bit, but I'm wondering if you can go into a little bit more detail. This is not an automated process, specifically the setup. I mean, what kind of process should someone be going into just, when they open up this dashboard and see that some of these fields are just completely empty? How do they go from kind of zero to a good starting point? What do you recommend?
The first thing I would say is just, start with the out-of-box jobs. That's a good baseline. Just run, setting up those initial jobs, letting the scans run, just to build your baseline and say, okay, what are we even remotely looking at? And then from there, like I had said before, sitting down with your teams, your CI owners, and saying, what are the things that we recommend are populated, and then building those rules into the dashboard itself. There's a bit of setup here, and it's not going to be perfect. The out-of-box ones are, they're basic, they're standard, but every organization is going to be different. So, customizing that dashboard, customizing those rules, customizing those jobs to care about the fields that you want to track. That's kind of one of those initial setup processes that you have to do to get the most out of the tool.
And Jeff, we had a question about, what are some of the failure causes in the dashboard, specifically on the completeness tool?
Yeah, so the failure causes, as in, why isn't the completeness implemented, or why isn't the completeness defined?
We'd have to assume probably what they mean here, unless they
Yeah,
follow
yeah.
quickly.
So sure. So typically the completeness. So follow on to Blake's point, and this kind of comes up. I don't want to give too much of a spoiler in the homework section, but really focusing, narrowing in on critical classes. So again, not trying to boil the ocean. We're not going to define a broad recommended or required field for all classes. I would target a few select classes, and then, to Blake's point, grab the Windows Server team, sit down with them and say, what information do you find valuable? Or sit down with the service desk team and say, when you're tracking, when you're creating incidents and you want to get a hold, who are you looking for? So networking or working with the teams to identify key pieces of information, define those key pieces of information, consider it, those key piece of information is critical, and then adding that to the recommended list of recommended fields in the CI class manager. So I think, just to Blake's point, you run it initially, you see you're at 100%. That's an issue in itself. Then you want to get that number again back down to about 2/3 or even less. Define a couple of key classes that you want to refine or define recommended fields against, and then run it again and try to improve that number.
So let's say that your number is closer to 50%. How would you recommend someone approaching that and improving that number?
Yeah, so then start off with, so if you're at 50%, obviously, if let's just take the simple assumption or simple approach that, let's say we're defining the owned by as the only recommended field. Now we're focused on computers, and 50% of computers have an owned by. So we have a simple use case. Well, I would sit down and see if there's a way to either, one, populate the majority of those computers, right? Let's say, or computers is a bad example, Windows servers. Let's say for the 50% of Windows servers that are missing owned by, can we pre-populate 25% of those with a common owner, right? Can we, and then that goes back to, is there a discovery source or an automated source that we can actually pre-populate those? And then that kind of gets in the data certification plugin. But to remediate it, it's a multi-phased approach. But effectively, you want to identify the class that is missing, the majority of that it has a poor CMDB health score, and then remediate that class programmatically. So whether that be assign a data steward to own those owned by fields, and that kind of gets into our next slide here. But really, the data certification plugin tool is a really effective way to take action on those poor CMDB health scores.
Yeah, and I hope that answers your question. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think we are kind of definitely starting to get into this next slide here. And Blake, I know that you were kind of starting to get into that as well. And so this is really, the idea that once you see that your CMDB does need help, and you see that there are areas that could stand some improvements. And as we saw, about a third of people are not really happy with the health state of their CMDB. This is really a good way for us to sort of create a framework for you. And you know what I did here? An R and 3 Ds. So it is harder than it looks, right? So I could have done a better job. But yeah, Blake, why don't you go ahead and just kind of jump into this information here. And just so everyone knows, we will be sending out, along with the video, the slide deck here. So if this is kind of can serve as a cheat sheet for anyone, you will have access to this in a PDF format after the presentation.
Yeah, totally. So when we talk about bringing that pruning that garden, bringing it back to health. How do we fix what we have out there? How do we make things better? These are kind of a couple of different ways that we usually see people try to approach, and you can approach them one at a time, multiple ways. But generally it falls down to reconciliation, which is the general concept of putting in reconciliation rules to automate some of these remediation tasks. So, for example, Jeff was talking about, hey, we've got a Windows server that doesn't have an owner. Okay, well, we can build remediation rules that automatically see that data, see that problem, and can go out and, maybe drops an email out to the Windows team and just saying, hey, who owns this? Like, somebody needs to know. Or you can say, somebody gets assigned a task and assigns a task out to the Windows team just to say, go populate this data, go do this. In addition, reconciliation also helps us with removing different duplicate CIs, maybe CIs that should be retired that have just not been moved into a certain state. Being able to validate all of that information with reconciliation rules is a pretty powerful tool. The next way is data precedence. So we see this, I've seen this so many times, it's not even funny. Multiple sources of truth. Everybody has them. Most organizations have, 2, 3, 4 different things bringing data into the CMDB. Between ServiceNow, own discovery tool, SCCM, there's tons of them out there. But a lot of times we notice that people don't actually bother to take the time to set up data precedence rules. And what these essentially do is they allow you to make and define a source of truth. And specifically, which source of truth do you trust more? So if you've got SCCM and ServiceNow Discovery, for example, and Discovery is scanning all of these Windows computers, and SCCM is loading that data in via the, say the SCCM out-of-box integration. Setting up the data precedence to say, hey, if Discovery scans this thing, we kind of trust what it says more. That allows us to kind of remove that whole flip-flopping data precedence problem, but it also allows you to know, hey, these are the things that matter. This is the source of truth that we care most about. And, when you've got multiple sources populating data, one of the big problems you can see in your CMDB is data just flopping back and forth constantly. Mm-hmm. Maybe SCCM has the CPU defined as an Intel, whatever, and Discovery maybe has it actually as like this is an Intel i7 to, so on forth. It's like they're different words, so the system sees them as different things. So whenever each source runs, they, just essentially just paste data over one another over and over and over again. And that data precedence helps us remove that problem as well as manage that problem and allows these multiple sources to interact better. Mm-hmm. Moving on to data certification, this is actually a out-of-box plugin, but it's not activated out-of-box. You actually do have to turn it on, but it is an out-of-box plugin. This is kind of a fun little tool that allows you to assign data stewards. This is not necessarily, a ServiceNow administrator and your CMDB administrator would be the ones to help configure this, but this is not their job. This is essentially allowing you to go out and assign essentially assign tasks out to individuals in your organization to validate and help you maintain that CMDB. As a ServiceNow administrator, I have no idea if a Windows server's data is actually correct. I don't know if this is the correct supported by. I don't know if this is the correct owner or anything like that. Or just, I don't know if this stuff has been updated in a while. Maybe, the person who's marked as an owner isn't even an employee anymore. Maybe he quit a year ago. So data certification allows us to set these things up for, kind of going back in and certifying your data again. Not just from the sources of data that will bring in automated information such as CPU, RAM, and stuff like that, but as well as the manually entered information into your CMDB.
Now, Blake, real quick. Now, you mentioned that the data certification feature is out of box. Is that the same for reconciliation and data precedence? Are those features that you need to activate, or how do those work specifically?
So reconciliation rules as well as data precedence, I believe, are both out of box and they are automatically turned on. They're
Okay.
part of the CMDB class managers as well as CMDB management in general. Data certification itself is just a separate plugin that you have to turn on if you want to utilize it.
Okay.
And it's fun because then you can set up essentially like quarterly or maybe biannually reviews of your data just to help kind of keep that health dashboard up to date, fight that 99%, and also to fight that stale data marker. If something's going stale, that's a problem. Data certification helps you kind of make sure that at least somebody's looked at this occasionally and says, hey, okay, this is still good.
Mm-hmm.
The final piece is a dedicated admin. And I think over the past few years, me and Jeff have started harking this one a little bit more than we used to. CMDB is a living, breathing environment. It is a garden. It is something that has to be maintained because everything in ServiceNow is built off of it. As your organization matures, incident, problem, change, automation, orchestration, all of these things that help your organization be lean, fast, swift, and make incredibly, smart decisions are all based on that CMDB. So
Mm-hmm.
having that dedicated CMDB administrator, you know, manage all of these things, learn data certification, learn data precedence, help with the reconciliation of all this stuff, manage your health dashboard, you know, it can be an incredibly intensive job, and it's not something that you can just dump on someone and expect them to understand it. You know, a dedicated admin is usually someone that also knows ServiceNow. At least, I would expect them to be a ServiceNow administrator certified. But after that, it's just a matter of learning the tools and learning the CMDB itself.
Now, we mentioned here that it's a daily activity. I mean, would you say that that's true for every company, or would you say that for some smaller companies or some smaller ServiceNow operations, it's really more like a weekly activity, or how would you define that?
I think it depends on the level of maturity of your organization as well as the size of your organization. It can be a daily activity, 100%. Someone coming in, taking a look at that health dashboard in the morning, making decisions, working on reconciling the data, working on maintaining the data certificate, making sure all the data is certified. All of those things are daily activities.
Hmm.
But is it a full-time activity? Well, that depends on how big your CMDB is. Maybe in phase one it's not, but maybe in phase two where, hey, we've only done Windows and now we're bringing in Linux and now we're bringing in all of our Mac devices and all that fun stuff. Maybe this becomes a bigger and bigger, like as your CMDB grows, the more time it takes to prune the garden grows.
Hmm. Yeah, I know one analogy that we make pretty frequently. I think we actually heard it from a customer first, is that a CMDB is also like a small child that you turn away from it for a short period of time, and the next time you notice that it's there, some kind of hell is broken loose. Um, I
Definitely.
think, thinking again about the garden, it's if you spend 1 week away from your garden and you come back to it, it's in a completely different state than you expect. So I think that that's probably one of the more controversial statements that we need to make, though, in this with this information here, is that we talk about how hard it is to measure ROI for your CMDB, and it's because so much of it is reliant on what it does, but it doesn't maybe present immediate value. And then we start saying you need a whole person to work on this. Now we're presenting it as more of a liability, more of an expense for the company. But then when you turn around and think about what are you giving up, without a fully properly functioning CMDB, you are going to have difficulty with automation. You are going to have difficulty with outages happening, and it's now, instead of an ROI issue, it's an opportunity cost issue. What are you giving up by not maintaining this to its fullest extent? So I think that's a great point. I think it's probably one of the harder things. So how would you recommend to someone that is telling their boss, we need a full-time person on their CMDB? How do you, and this is probably a question that you guys can't answer, how do you recommend that they respond and say to sell that value and to understand that this is something that that the business is going to rely on?
$1 million question. So I think it starts with again, identifying the usage. Are we leveraging the CMDB? Do we have configuration items identified on all of our incidents, some of our incidents, none of our incidents? The less you use your CMDB, the more opportunity there is. I think maybe the question about how the amount of time it would be required is initially up front. It's going to certainly be a full time. It's going to be likely daily as things mature, as kind of the CMDB becomes a little bit more. You've laid the mulch down. You've done all that. It becomes a little bit less. So it's just like with any project, you need a fully dedicated resource, at least initially. But beyond that, I think it's a really hard, and it's something we've done with clients, but it requires a lot of intimate detail with the customer and with their history in the past. How the CMDB has been used and not used.
Yeah.
Also with the roadmap, what opportunities? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, you just hit the nail on the head, Jeff. Like roadmap, like what are you going to use your CMDB for in the future? What do you see yourself doing with ServiceNow? Like, do you see yourself going into the automated space, orchestrating some of your manual tasks, taking some of that workload off your help desk by orchestrating a lot of these fixes? Those are the types of things where your CMDB starts coming into play really heavily, and having that guy around to make sure that all that works all the time and nobody has to go in and manually fix it.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey guys, you know what? It's right now it's about 10 till the end of the hour. I do want to jump to a couple of other questions that I know that people asked, but I want to point out some information that we will be handing out shortly after the podcast here. So if you are interested in some action items, some tangibles that you can take away from what we discussed, I have included some homework here that you guys can, if you're interested in any stage of the CMDB process, either in just defining what your health is or trying to develop that plan for health, or even if you're in a state where it's not healthy and you want to try to increase your score. We've put some rough activities here. Jeff, since we are a little bit short on time, is there anything that you want to point out that maybe we have not defined here in our conversation so far?
No, I think just to reiterate this, right? We're not boiling the ocean here. You'll see on the homework for these pieces, we want to identify, a class or two that we want to prioritize. We don't want to try and prioritize the entire CMDB. So that kind of that's across the board. We want to focus, incremental improvement. So just to drop that nugget of knowledge, but everything else I think is pretty straightforward here.
Okay, and so we'll be handing that out. A couple of questions I wanted to hop to, since I know that everyone else may need to get back to their day-to-day jobs. I know that we have someone that was mentioning that they are trying to work with the CMDB as far as integrations, and that's been a complication for them. So since their Qualys and their ServiceNow are not integrated, they're saying, how would you approach configuration in that type of environment, working with those disparate systems?
Yeah.
Is that a question that we can? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, so Qualys and ServiceNow, there are integrations, and I'm not exactly clear on the specific integration that isn't quite working, but obviously with vulnerability response, there's a Qualys integration, and the goal, kind of getting back to one of the pieces we talked about, is identification rules, is making sure that, I think Qualys has a unique host ID. There are a couple of unique identifiers. Is ultimately we want to find a source of truth, and typically clients defer to ServiceNow as the source of truth. So when we're talking about kind of merging or dealing with disparate systems and merging disparate systems data, we really want to identify a source of truth and make sure that we're coalescing on unique values. And I think with Qualys in particular, I think the host ID is the unique identifier. but it's kind of a separate topic, and we certainly can talk offline about it.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
this is true for. Mhm.
yeah, it would need to be integrated, obviously, for the CMDB to really do its job, I would imagine, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, Aaron, yeah, let's connect afterwards. It sounds like we can talk a little bit more about that more specifically for you. But we have a question right now. What is the benefit of having discovery specifically versus SCCM for populating the CMDB?
I can take that. It really just depends on like the data types. SCCM is a really good tool for grabbing Windows data. It's all built off Windows architecture, but ServiceNow Discovery is a bit more broad. It can scan all those Windows devices, and at the same time, we can pick up all the Linux data. We can pick up all the networking gear. You know, each tool has its value. I certainly don't. I don't necessarily put one above the other ever. I don't really try to do that with any of the integration tools and different, CMDB management tools out there. Maybe I might be a little bit biased because I have been doing discovery basically all of my ServiceNow career. So I love discovery as a tool itself, but you know, that's data precedence is really going to come into play. So take a look at the data that's coming from SCCM. Take a look at the data that Discovery is giving you, and then compare them and decide, which one do you care about more? Which one looks more correct to you?
Now, obviously, this is a service that Cerna Solutions provides. I mean, that's obviously, part of why we're having the podcast. And, in the spirit of WebMD, when do you call the doctor? When is it something that you think that, at what point do you think in the CMDB health, it makes sense for you to work with a partner or work with an outside resource to try and come in and bring things back to where they should be?
I think when you don't have a resource that understands, your overall processes, that's where you can start coming in and bringing, that's the value we bring to the table is, we come in, we learn about your organization, we learn about your processes, and we can make recommendations based on our experience.
Yeah, and I also think one of the benefits of involving outside vendors is sometimes it's easier to have an external vendor come in and exact change. It's sometimes easier to pull in that resource, and if maybe some practices, or I'll use the term good practices, aren't adopted or enforced, sometimes easier to have a new face to make prescribed changes or try to shake things up a little bit. So that's usually a case where it's helpful to have a consultant come in and talk about we've probably, Blake and I collectively have done over 100 implementations. We've seen 100 ways to fail, 100 ways to succeed. So that's obviously some of the benefits we bring in different perspectives. So
Sure. Okay. Any other questions that people have? I think we've covered a fair amount of them, but if I have not answered your question right now, feel free to throw it into the questions again in case it got lost in the shuffle. We're seeing a lot of activity coming through here. Okay, hold on. I do see one more question. I want to make sure that I hop onto that one. Oh, so we had a question specifically about is there any value in adding workstations, laptops, desktops, etc., not as assets specifically, but as CI?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think adding workstations or computers as CIs is very valuable. Especially with incident management. Granted, you likely won't apply many changes to the specific workstations, but certainly, the more information you have, the more knowledge of your environment, the better. I know, we've had some discovery issues with workstations based off of when, based on when they're online, when to scan those devices. But I think it's very useful to have them.
Definitely. Long term for those, I've seen customers that have done, remote installations because they have those workstation data involved in their system. They know who has each laptop, so someone can go out into your service catalog, request a software, and orchestration can automatically install that on their computer as long as they have the approvals. So.
Mhm.
Yeah. And another thing too, with getting into software asset management, we're tracking device-based entitlements. That's a place where you can leverage workstation. So there are a lot of tie-ins.
Oh yeah.
All right. Well, everyone, I think we did it. We're right up until the hour. I want to thank everyone who joined for joining us today. I know that in this holiday season, sometimes it's not always easy to take an hour out of your time to focus on the improvement of your company and how your understanding of what ServiceNow can do. But we absolutely appreciate everyone that's joined us. We will be doing more of these events. So like I said at the top, make sure that you go to cernasolutions.com and take a look at our resources to see what other kind of events we have. Follow us on LinkedIn, join us on YouTube if you want to see some of the other content that we've been doing, and we greatly appreciate it. Blake, Jeff, you guys have been very generous with your time. Thank you so much for lending your expertise today.
A pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for hosting.
Absolute blast.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much, everyone. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks a lot.
Hey, everyone.
Bye.